November 24, 1944, from Northfield on Tinian and Isley Field on Saipan, the 21st Bomber Command launches 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses toward the Japanese mainland. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell leads the American Strategic Bombing Force from his headquarters on Guam. Those gleaming silver bombers carry 277 tons of explosives aimed at the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant on the outskirts of Tokyo. What Japanese fighter pilots are about to experience this morning will completely change how they understand air combat and expose a technological gap that no amount of courage or determination can bridge. Captain Tatsuo Yamada tightens his oxygen mask in the cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian, parked at Chofu Airfield near Tokyo. During the morning briefing, the emphasis was clear: intercept the incoming bombers with the greatest possible altitude advantage. Intelligence reports suggest that large four-engine bombers are flying in from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, at altitudes never seen before. Yamada volunteers for the high-altitude interception mission, a fight that promises to be difficult, and against an enemy whose true capabilities remain largely unknown. His aircraft is armed with four 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, weapons ideal for mid-altitude dogfights, where Japanese fighters traditionally excelled. The challenge of altitude was something new. Japan's earlier encounters with American heavy bombers in China, back in early 1944, had involved B-24 Liberators and older B-17 Flying Fortresses, aircraft that flew between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, well within the reach of Japanese interceptors. Major Teishi Maeda had developed tactics for those engagements: gain altitude before contact, not during combat. A pilot who was already higher than his target had the energy advantage, a critical factor when trying to take down heavily armed bombers. But today's intelligence reports say these new bombers are flying much higher than anything seen before. The 21st Bomber Command represents America's most powerful air deployment in the Pacific since the Doolittle Raid of 1942. Eventually, it will consist of over 1,000 aircraft operating from 5 major airfields across Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, all equipped with pressurized cabins built specifically for extreme high-altitude missions across the vast Pacific. That design philosophy is a big departure from earlier bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator had unpressurized cabins, forcing crews to wear heavy flight suits and oxygen masks. That limited them to about 25,000 feet. With the B-29, American engineers made a bold trade-off. They added complexity, but gained the ability to fly well above the reach of most enemy interceptors. Thanks to its pressurization system, B-29 crews could operate in shirt sleeves at altitudes where others would freeze or pass out from lack of oxygen. Meanwhile, Yamada's squadron Ki-61 Heian fighters from the 244th Sentai and Ki-44 Shoki interceptors from the 47th Sentai scramble from multiple airfields around Tokyo, climbing as fast as they can. Far above them, the Japanese pilots can see thin white contrails forming high in the stratosphere, the American bombers approaching from the southeast. Radar operators at Chiba detect the incoming formation at between 27,000 and 31,000 feet, shifting altitudes as they navigate weather fronts. Ground controllers direct the defending fighters toward the incoming threat, but even at full climb rate, most interceptors can barely reach 25,000 feet before the bombers are overhead. Right away, the technological gap is obvious. Yamada's aircraft, designed back in 1941 for medium-altitude combat over China and the early Pacific Front, simply wasn't built for this. His Ki-61 weighs about 7,650 pounds, powered by a 1,175 horsepower Kawasaki HA-40 liquid-cooled engine, giving a top speed of 368 mph at 16,400 feet. On paper, it can reach 36,000 feet, but in real combat, performance drops sharply above 28,000. The engine loses power in the thin air, and the controls grow heavy and unresponsive. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, added after early war experience, give the plane better protection, but also make it heavier and slower to climb. The Ki-44 interceptors from the 47th Sentai, designed for high-altitude interception, also struggle. In the thin, freezing air, their engines overheat and lose power. The oxygen systems, built for short, low-level fights, can't keep up. Most planes stall out around 28,000 feet, still far below the B-29s. Those that actually reach firing range arrive with engines straining and pilots gasping for air. The few who get high enough to engage can barely control their aircraft. The thin air robs them of lift, and their control surfaces respond sluggishly. Meanwhile, the B-29s hold perfect formation high above, cruising steadily and comfortably. Inside their pressurized cabins, the American crews are calm, working without the bulky gear that burdened bomber crews just a few years earlier. Captain Robert Morgan commands the lead Superfortress Dauntless Dottie, while navigator Captain Theodore Van Kirk locks onto the target using the Norden bomb sight. The bomber's four Wright R-3350 engines each deliver 2,200 horsepower, keeping the plane above 300 mph even at 30,000 feet. Turbo superchargers maintain full power despite the thin atmosphere, something no Japanese aircraft could do. A narrow pressurized tunnel runs over the bomb bays, connecting the front and rear crew sections so the men can move around freely without oxygen masks or bulky suits. This revolutionary design makes sustained operations at extreme altitude possible, and for Japan's defenders below, it marks the moment they realize the sky itself now belongs to a new generation of aircraft. The B-29's central fire control system coordinates all of its defensive guns through a network of analog computers, letting gunners track and fire at multiple targets at once, all while sitting comfortably inside pressurized positions. Meanwhile, Yamada pushes his Ki-61 to its absolute limit. The airspeed indicator barely shows 180 miles per hour as the fighter struggles to stay aloft in the thin air, nearing 30,000 feet. His pre-war training never prepared him for combat this high. The briefing that morning had stressed attacking from above in diving passes to keep energy advantage, but climbing above the bombers turns out to be impossible. The tactics Japan had developed against unescorted B-17s and B-24s flying at moderate altitudes simply do not work here. The Hien barely manages to sustain 30,000 feet for a few seconds before stalling out, forcing Yamada to recover and lose 3,000 feet in the process. Each climb attempt ends the same way. The engine temperature gauges redline, oil pressure fluctuates dangerously, and performance keeps fading. He can see the contrails of the B-29s far above him, their gunners tracking his fighter through their sights but not firing. The range is just too great. The difference in altitude is so vast that real combat becomes impossible, no matter how desperate the Japanese effort or how early the warning. That morning, only about 40 Japanese fighters even managed to get close enough to attempt an attack on the formation. Most can make just one firing pass before losing too much speed and altitude. Their bullets, fired upward in thin air, lose velocity almost immediately. Many rounds simply fall short. Those few pilots who actually reach effective range have no energy left for sustained combat. They can squeeze off only brief bursts before their planes stall out again. Anti-aircraft fire is just as helpless. Shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers, even at maximum gun elevation. On paper, Japan's largest anti-aircraft guns can reach 30,000 feet, but in reality, accuracy at that height is nearly impossible. The November 24th raid becomes the first massive B-29 attack on Tokyo since the symbolic Doolittle raid nearly 3 years earlier. The American formation stays perfectly on course toward its target, the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, Japan's most vital aircraft engine factory. Lieutenant Coleman, the lead bombardier, releases his payload on signal, followed by the rest of the formation dropping in sequence from slightly different altitudes. But powerful jet stream winds, some exceeding 200 miles per hour, scatter the bombs. Only 24 aircraft hit the primary target. The rest strike secondary objectives or miss entirely. Yet the psychological impact is enormous. For the first time, bombs fall on Tokyo from a height the defenders cannot reach. Japanese fighters circle far below, powerless to stop them. From the ground, people watch the contrails streaking across the sky at unimaginable altitude, far beyond any fighter's grasp. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, coordinating air defense from sector control, listens to frustrated reports pouring in from his pilots, engines failing, controls freezing, altitudes impossible to maintain. The bombers pass through Japanese airspace almost untouched. Only one is lost, and that from a desperate ramming attack by a damaged fighter, a tragic suicidal gesture of futility. The defenders burn through their fuel climbing in vain, most returning to base without ever firing a shot. The scale of American technological superiority shocks both pilots and commanders alike. The 21st Bomber Command ends its first Tokyo mission with barely any losses from enemy action, though a few B-29s have to ditch or divert because of mechanical issues. In total, Japanese fighters claim just one confirmed kill, the ramming. Bomber gunners, on the other hand, report shooting down 5 Japanese planes. The B-29's ability to operate at such altitude completely overturns everything Japan's air forces thought they knew about intercepting bombers. This failure isn't about bravery, it's about a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Americans have built and how revolutionary the Superfortress truly is. At Naval Headquarters, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda studies the reports with growing alarm. His analysis confirms what field officers already know. The B-29s are flying higher than any Japanese interceptor can reach. Even the Navy's newest aircraft are helpless at those altitudes. The strategic implications are obvious. Japan would need entirely new aircraft designs or some other form of defense to counter the threat. But there's no time and no resources left to make that happen. The intelligence failure runs deep. Japan had very little understanding of American pressurization systems or turbo-supercharged engines, the very technologies that make these high-altitude operations possible. Before this, Japanese planners assumed enemy bombers would always fly below 25,000 feet. Every bit of their combat experience had reinforced that belief. The B-29's pressurized cabin concept was barely understood at all, and no one in the imperial military truly grasped what it meant for air combat. Up to now, American bombers from China had always flown low enough to be intercepted. That era ends today. On December 3, 1944, another major B-29 raid hits Tokyo. 86 aircraft again target the Musashino plant. This time, the Japanese adapt. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the elite 244th Sentai develops new tactics. Get the fighters to maximum altitude before the bombers arrive, then dive down from above for a high-speed attack. But even with perfect timing, the Ki-61s cannot climb high enough. Some planes are specially modified, armor removed, radios stripped out, ammunition reduced, all to save weight. These lightweight interceptors climb slightly better, but still can't reach effective altitude. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi leads a new ramming unit called Hagakuritai, volunteers ready to die if that's what it takes to stop the bombers. Their aircraft are stripped to the bare minimum, carrying just enough fuel for a one-way trip. With engines pushed beyond their limits and manifold pressure deep into the red, the pilots climb toward the Americans. Before takeoff, they breathe pure oxygen for half an hour to prepare, but their systems are still too primitive. Even at full power, most fighters stall around 30,000 feet. Sergeant Masuaki Itaki manages to reach 31,500 feet in his modified Ki-61 and dives toward a straggling B-29. The bomber's defensive guns open up, tracers flashing through the sky. Several 50-caliber rounds tear into his aircraft, but Itaki refuses to break off. He holds his course until his engine dies. The fighter loses lift, stalls just 500 feet below the target, and then spins out of control, falling away into the clouds below.
The pilot manages to pull out of his spin at 20,000 feet. His aircraft is badly damaged, running low on fuel, and there's no chance of climbing again. The ramming attacks sometimes succeed, usually only when a bomber is already descending because of mechanical problems, but they can't be used as a reliable tactic. They're acts of desperation, not strategy. Through the end of 1944, losses among the B-29s remain minimal. Meanwhile, Japanese cities begin to suffer the first real waves of strategic bombing. The pilots defending the homeland feel deep frustration. They can see their country being attacked, yet there's nothing they can do to stop it. The proud samurai spirit that once defined Japan's warriors means nothing when the enemy is flying beyond reach. Many pilots describe feelings of helplessness and shame, knowing they're willing to die for Japan but unable to even reach the bombers to fight. By January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay takes over command of the 21st Bomber Command. True to his reputation, he throws himself into studying the results of the high-altitude daylight raids with relentless focus. The findings are grim. Accuracy is poor, largely because of the powerful jet stream winds discovered at those altitudes, sometimes blowing faster than 250 miles per hour. No one had known about these winds before the B-29 entered service. They shove the bombers across their flight paths so quickly that even the best bombardiers can't keep their aim steady. Navigation itself becomes a challenge. The situation gets worse during the winter months, when thick cloud cover often hides targets completely. Crews are forced to rely on radar bombing, which offers almost no precision. Between the winds and the weather, fewer than 10% of bombs are hitting their intended targets. LeMay faces increasing pressure from Washington. The enormous cost of the B-29 program demands results. After a detailed review of tactics, he makes a bold, controversial decision in March 1945. He orders the B-29s to switch to low-altitude night raids using incendiary bombs against Japan's cities. It's a radical shift, a complete rethinking of how the air war is fought. The bombers remove nearly all of their defensive guns except for the tail turrets, trading armor and weapon weight for maximum incendiary payload. That decision will completely transform the air campaign over Japan and the nature of modern warfare itself. Reducing bombing altitude from 30,000 feet down to between 5,000 and 9,000 eliminates the jet stream problem almost completely, but it also brings the bombers within range of Japan's defenses for the first time. The tactical shift changes everything. Now Japanese fighters can finally reach the bombers, and the entire dynamic of the air war transforms overnight. On March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House begins, the infamous Tokyo firebombing mission that will forever reshape strategic bombing doctrine. 334 B-29s approach the capital at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. For the first time, they're flying within the reach of every Japanese fighter. But the darkness of night and the sheer shock of this unexpected tactic throw Japan's defenses into chaos. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambles from Matsudo Airfield in his Nakajima Ki-44. For the first time, he climbs easily to the bomber's altitude, but that's where the advantage ends. Fighting at night brings new problems. With no airborne radar and almost no ground control, the interceptors struggle even to find their targets. Searchlights sweep across the black sky, briefly locking onto the silver bombers as anti-aircraft guns open fire at point-blank range. The first time in the war they've been able to. Ki-44s and Ki-61s make desperate solo attacks without radio coordination or formation tactics. Mitsuyoshi manages several firing passes, seeing his rounds strike engines and fuselages. Some bombers trail flames, a few drop in altitude, but most keep flying, undeterred. The B-29s prove astonishingly tough, shrugging off hits that would have destroyed earlier bombers. Even in the dark, their radar-directed gun turrets return precise, deadly fire. Japanese pilots trained for daylight dogfights find themselves blind and disoriented in the darkness. Below, the incendiary bombing ignites a firestorm that devours 16 square miles of Tokyo. Over 100,000 people die in a single night, the deadliest air raid in human history. Japanese fighters claim 14 B-29s destroyed, their highest total of the war, but it's nowhere near enough to stop the devastation. Low altitude makes interception possible, yet the massive bomber formations, the darkness, and the surprise of the new tactic make defense almost meaningless. LeMay's gamble pays off completely. The firebombing of Tokyo validates his radical strategy, setting the model for all future raids. Overnight, Japan's entire high-altitude interceptor program becomes irrelevant. Research into high-altitude engines and pressurized cockpits, projects that consumed precious wartime resources, suddenly means nothing. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi of the Imperial Navy flies Japan's newest interceptor, the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, during B-29 raids over Nagoya in early 1945. On paper, the Raiden can reach 36,000 feet thanks to its supercharged Kasei engine. But in combat, that theoretical advantage collapses. At those heights, the controls are sluggish, the engine's weak, and the air so thin that even the supercharger can't maintain power. Pilots report being unable to line up proper lead or pursuit angles. Even when they do reach bomber altitude, they simply can't maneuver. The Raiden requires perfect positioning. It has to be in place before the bombers arrive, because once they pass overhead, climbing pursuit is impossible. Many pilots also suffer from oxygen failures that cause dizziness or unconsciousness at altitude. The few successful interceptions happen only against damaged stragglers, not the main formations. By April 1945, Japan begins organizing coordinated kamikaze attacks directly against B-29s. Conventional interception has failed, so the military forms special attack units dedicated solely to ramming the bombers. On April 12, Corporal Kashi Ogawa crashes his plane into the B-29 Torchi over Kawasaki. Both aircraft are destroyed. That same day, another act of extraordinary courage takes place on the American side. Staff Sergeant Henry Irwin earns the Medal of Honor after a phosphorus flare ignites inside his aircraft. The flare explodes, burning through his face and body, blinding him instantly. Despite his horrific injuries, Irwin carries the flaming device through the plane and throws it out the cockpit window, saving all 11 of his crewmates. His actions, and those of men like him, capture the shared bravery of both sides, even in a war defined by technological imbalance. Across Japan, more kamikaze units form, made up of volunteers willing to die trying to stop the B-29s. These ramming attacks destroy perhaps 10 bombers in total, a negligible fraction of the fleet. But psychologically, they shake American crews, who now know that enemy pilots might deliberately crash into them. Still, even these suicide missions cannot alter the outcome. The B-29's centralized fire control system remains devastatingly effective, despite the bombers now carrying fewer gun positions than the old B-17s. The remote-controlled turrets, managed by onboard analog computers, can track multiple attackers at once. Japanese pilots describe the defensive fire as unnervingly accurate. The turrets stay locked on even when the bombers are weaving or under attack. Because the gunners operate safely from inside pressurized cabins, damage to one position doesn't cripple the system. Where earlier bombers would lose defensive arcs as crewmen were hit, the B-29 continues firing automatically. This innovation, combined with altitude and armor, makes the Superfortress nearly untouchable. Then, in April 1945, the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts from Iwo Jima changes everything again. With these new fighters, the Americans achieve total air superiority over Japan. Daylight B-29 missions become even safer. Now Japanese interceptors have to fight through swarms of Mustangs before they can even reach the bombers. The few who break through find themselves immediately hunted by the escorts. Captain Yasuhiko Kuro, commanding the 64th Sentai, flies Japan's best frontline fighter, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. It's fast, powerful, and capable of reaching over 34,000 feet under ideal conditions. With a stripped-down loadout, pilots can sustain around 32,000 feet, but even that performance fades above 28,000, as the Ha-45 engine loses strength in the thin air. The Hayate performs brilliantly when it can meet bombers at lower altitudes, especially during mining missions over the ocean, where B-29s fly below 20,000 feet. In those conditions, Japanese pilots score several victories, but when the bombers return to high-altitude daylight raids, the same problem remains. The fighters simply cannot reach them. Despite every technological improvement, the gap in performance persists to the very end of the war, a stark reminder that courage alone could not bridge the distance between innovation and desperation.
By June 1945, Japan rolled out the Kawasaki Ki-100, essentially a Ki-61 airframe fitted with a reliable radial engine to replace the temperamental liquid-cooled power plants. The change made the plane much more dependable and pleasant to fly, but it cost something. High-altitude performance suffered compared with the inline engine versions. In medium-altitude fights, the Ki-100 proved lively, highly maneuverable, and popular with pilots, but its radial engine could not support sustained operations near the extreme ceiling. In practice, its service ceiling topped out around 32,000 feet, short of what was needed to challenge the highest B-29 missions. Pilots praised the Ki-100's handling, but everyone admitted it still lacked the altitude to intercept B-29s effectively. Japan had, in effect, produced one of its best operational fighters, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the course of the air war. Through 1945, Japanese industry scrambled up a variety of specialized high-altitude interceptor prototypes. The Mitsubishi Ki-83 twin-engine fighter promised great altitude performance with turbo-supercharged power plants. Kawasaki's Ki-102 heavy fighter packed armament built specifically to shred bombers. Yet these programs were crippled by shortages. High-grade aluminum, special alloys for superchargers, and other materials simply were not available in the quantities needed. Manufacturing bottlenecks and repeated bombing raids destroyed most prototypes before they could be fielded. B-29 strikes systematically demolished aircraft factories and engine plants, production lines halted, and Japan's ability to replace lost equipment collapsed. The Akashi Engine Works, which had been producing the Ha-40 engine for early Ki-61s, burned in January 1945, another body blow to any hope of catching up. Month by month, the technological gap widened. American B-29 improvements marched forward, while Japanese industrial capacity crumbled. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets led special training for atomic delivery missions, exploiting the B-29's extreme altitude capability. Some B-29s were further modified, the so-called silverplate machines, stripped of most defensive armament except tail guns, to maximize altitude and range, ensuring that an aircraft assigned to carry a nuclear weapon would be essentially immune to interception. August 6, 1945 would make the point starkly. As Enola Gay approached Hiroshima at about 31,600 feet, Japanese fighters scrambled but could not reach her. Lieutenant Matsuo Yasui pushed his Ki-61 desperately and managed something like 29,000 feet before stalling, still 2,000 feet below the bomber. Other interceptors fared no better. Even in perfect weather, most could not top 27,000 feet. The bomb detonated while fighters circled powerless beneath, unable to stop or even fully understand what had happened. The same pattern repeated on August 9th, when Boxcar delivered the second weapon over Nagasaki. Fighters launched in force but could not reach the bomber's operating altitude. Post-war analysis made the reasons clear. Pressurization and turbo-supercharging let American crews live and work comfortably at altitudes where Japanese engines and oxygen systems produced only a fraction of their rated power. Turbochargers kept Allied engines breathing where naturally aspirated Japanese power plants choked. The accumulated advantages, altitude sanctuary, robust engines, and crew survivability proved decisive for strategic bombing effectiveness. Japanese pilots showed remarkable courage and skill within the brutal limitations of their machines, but individual determination could not close the gap imposed by engineering and industrial capacity. High-altitude combat demanded technical solutions Japan simply could not produce in wartime. The specialized steels, alloys, and manufacturing volumes required for reliable superchargers and high-performance engines were not available. The B-29 campaign validated the American investment in advanced bomber design and immense industrial output. Operational sanctuary at altitude became the linchpin of strategic bombing. Bravery alone could not erase the advantage. The campaign reshaped post-war thinking worldwide. Pressurization, supercharging, and sustained high-altitude penetration would be central to future strategic doctrine. In Japan, senior leaders like General Korochika Anami confronted the harsh reality. B-29 superiority had nullified geographic defenses and the traditional fighting spirit. Without a credible way to stop the bomber raids, continued resistance became increasingly meaningless.
Former Ki-61 pilots later recalled the desperate climbs and red-line gauges in post-war memoirs, how they pushed engines until temperature needles swung into the danger zone, watching leaders bail out while they struggled on, reaching a few thousand feet short of the bombers. One pilot remembered, his flight leader's engine caught fire at 28,000 feet. The leader bailed out, and the pilot kept climbing to perhaps 30,000 before the controls went dead. From the bomber's central fire control position, American gunners watched the tiny figures of interceptors straining below them, growing and then stalling like leaves in the wind. Often the attackers would get close enough that crewmen could pick out the red Hinamaru on the wings, then the fighters would tumble away. It was a scene of quiet, wrenching pity. Every advantage lay with the bomber: altitude, speed, firepower, and armor, while the defenders had only courage. Courage was not enough against physics. Those lessons fed straight into Cold War doctrine. Strategic Air Command folded the B-29's operational experience into the emerging nuclear delivery concept. High-altitude penetration, pressurized crews, and supercharged engines became foundational principles for strategic bombers. Pressurization and turbocharging technologies advanced rapidly on the basis of combat experience over Japan, shaping the design of the next generation of long-range strategic aircraft.
The advantages the B-29 demonstrated over Japan reshaped the future of bomber design. The lessons from those raids guided the development of jet-powered strategic bombers that would later operate at even higher altitudes and greater speeds. After Japan's surrender, engineers from its shattered aviation industry studied captured B-29s and the technical documents left behind. What they found was sobering. The American aircraft represented not just a single step forward, but multiple technological generations of advancement. Pressurization systems featured intricate sealing mechanisms and reinforced structures far beyond what Japan's wartime factories could produce. Turbo supercharging required precision machining and exotic alloys that had simply never been available in Japan. Even the B-29's remote-controlled gun turrets used analog computers more advanced than any Japanese military system, packed with vacuum tubes and micro-precision servos that local industry couldn't replicate. The study revealed the real cost of industrial inferiority. A modern Air Force required not only brave pilots but a technological and manufacturing base capable of supporting them. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who commanded the Enola Gay, later reflected on this altitude advantage during the atomic missions. "We knew the Japanese fighters couldn't reach us," he said. "That meant we could focus completely on the mission. They could see us, track us on radar, but they couldn't touch us. It was like flying behind bulletproof glass. Their inability to intercept guaranteed success before we even reached the target." On the other side, Captain Iwa Hayashi, a Ki-84 pilot, remembered the opposite experience. "Even in our best fighters, reaching the bombers was nearly impossible. Above 30,000 feet, the engine coughed and lost power. The controls turned soft, like flying through molasses. If we got one firing pass, we were lucky. Then we'd stall and fall away. Watching them continue on untouched while our cities burned, it was helplessness I'll never forget." Examination of crashed B-29s only deepened the realization. The pressurized fuselage used advanced rubber compounds Japan couldn't manufacture, and its reinforced frame required precision welding and quality control that Japanese factories couldn't match. Even the smallest components, wiring, insulation, servo gears, bearings, were of higher quality than anything built domestically. Major Toshio Sakagawa, commander of the elite 204th Yantatai, later summed up the experience bluntly. "My pilots were among Japan's best, men with years of combat behind them, but we accomplished almost nothing against the B-29s. Every report told the same story: engines failing at 28 or 29,000 feet, controls freezing, and the bombers passing overhead untouched. It was a complete and humiliating defeat by technology." B-29 bombardier Lieutenant Marcus McDilder remembered watching those desperate attacks over Osaka. "The Japanese pilots had incredible determination. We'd see them climbing for 15-20 minutes, just tiny dots getting closer. Some tried zoom climbs, trading speed for altitude, but they could barely reach us. They'd fire a few bursts, stall, and tumble away. We rarely had to shoot. The altitude itself was our armor." It was, in truth, a one-sided contest defined not by courage but by engineering. Even Germany, Japan's closest ally, had faced similar struggles. Reports from Japanese attachés in Europe described the Luftwaffe's difficulties intercepting Allied bombers above 25,000 feet. Even with superior engines and better technology, the Germans had trouble. Only the new Mi-26 Wheeling Todfighter achieved limited success thanks to its speed and climb rate, capabilities Japan simply couldn't duplicate before the war ended. Though Japan tried to copy German jet designs, shortages of critical materials and precision tools made it impossible. By 1945, strategic bombing had crushed what was left of the country's industrial infrastructure.
The technological gap had become an unbridgeable chasm. Colonel John Montgomery, commanding the 9th Bombardment Group from Tinian, later summarized the shift. At first they threw everything into the sky, every plane they had, but by spring of '45, the daylight intercepts had all but stopped. They tried night attacks when we came in low. Smart move, but too late. The altitude advantage meant America's bombers could destroy Japan's industry virtually unopposed. Japanese maintenance officer Captain Hiroshi Fujiwara left behind detailed reports describing the constant mechanical breakdowns that plagued high-altitude operations. Engines overheated within minutes of full throttle above 25,000 feet. Oil pressure dropped, coolant boiled, and pilots suffered from oxygen failures. Many passed out, some never regained consciousness. Frostbite was common as pilots removed their gloves to manipulate frozen controls. The constant mechanical failures made sustained high-altitude operations impossible, no matter how determined the Japanese pilots were. Staff Sergeant James Pearson, a B-29 flight engineer, recalled monitoring the pressurization system during missions. Inside, it felt like we were at 8,000 feet, even when cruising above 30,000. We worked in comfort. No heavy suits, no frostbite, just moving around the cabin in shirt sleeves. Meanwhile, the enemy pilots outside were freezing, their controls locking up, their engines gasping for air. It wasn't a fair fight. Honestly, it wasn't even a fight. Corporal Shigo Yamamoto, a Japanese radar operator, described the same situation from the other side. Our radar could track them hundreds of miles away. We'd see the formations coming long before they reached us. But what good was warning when our planes couldn't climb that high? I'd direct fighters to intercept, knowing it was hopeless. The pilots would call in 27,000 feet, 28,000. Then silence. As the bombers passed far above, you could hear the frustration in their voices. We had the will, but not the means. By the war's final months, even Japan's own military reports admitted the truth. Defending against high-altitude B-29 raids had completely failed. Geography, determination, and early warning were worthless without matching technology. Japan's industry simply couldn't build aircraft capable of reaching the bombers, and that technological inferiority made homeland defense impossible. That realization played a quiet but important role in the decision to surrender. Once it was clear that continued resistance couldn't stop the destruction from the air, even the most die-hard officers began to accept the inevitable. On August 14, 1945, just one day before Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Kuniohi Tanaka flew the last attempted interception of the war. In his Ki-100, he clawed his way up to 28,000 feet before the engine lost power and forced him down. Above him, a lone B-29 cruised serenely at 35,000 feet, photographing the atomic devastation below for U.S. intelligence. That scene summed up the entire conflict, one side trying desperately to climb, the other untouchable. Sergeant William Ale, a B-29 radio operator, often listened to Japanese control frequencies during missions. We could hear their ground controllers giving headings and altitude orders, then the pilots responding that they couldn't climb higher, that engines were overheating. Sometimes you'd hear anger, sometimes resignation. They knew exactly where we were, but they couldn't stop us. Technology decided everything. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what the air crews already knew. Out of more than 30,000 B-29 sorties, only about 50 were lost to enemy fighters, a loss rate of less than 0.2%. Japanese aircraft were effective only when the bombers flew low due to weather or mechanical issues. At normal operational altitudes, the B-29's altitude sanctuary was absolute. Former Imperial Navy Commander Masatake Okumiya summed it up bluntly in post-war analysis. We had estimated a maximum B-29 altitude of 26,000 feet, based on B-17 and B-24 data. When they routinely flew above 30,000, our entire defensive plan collapsed. We lacked the time, the resources, and the technology to respond. For B-29 pilots, that altitude superiority was more than just safety, it was confidence. Colonel Robert Robbins described it this way: knowing the fighters couldn't reach us changed everything. We flew straight and level, no evasive maneuvers. The bombardiers had steady sights, and the crews stayed calm. The only real danger was mechanical failure. We owned the sky above 30,000 feet, and everyone knew it. On the ground, Japanese pilots felt the opposite. Captain Yoshiro Aoki remembered standing on his airfield, staring at the thin white contrails high above. Every mission ended the same way. We'd climb until the engines gave out, maybe reach 25,000 feet, and then watch silver lines stretching across the sky. Our swords were useless. We were samurai trying to reach the moon. That despair hit morale harder than combat losses ever could. General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, later reflected on what the B-29 program had achieved. Despite its enormous cost, greater even than the Manhattan Project, it proved worth every dollar. We showed that technology could win wars, Arnold said.
Pressurization, supercharging, precision systems, all of it paid off. The B-29 didn't just bomb cities, it changed what air power meant. Japanese engineer Tako Doi, designer of the Ki-61, later admitted that his aircraft never stood a chance. His analysis of post-war captured B-29s revealed just how far behind Japan had fallen. Entire generations of design, engineering, and production stood between the two nations. The B-29 had not only conquered Japan's skies, it had redefined modern warfare itself.
Our fighters were built for combat where air battles had always taken place between 15 and 25,000 feet. No one imagined bombers could operate comfortably above 30,000. By the time we realized it, modifying our existing designs was pointless. The engines, the airframes, even the oxygen systems simply couldn't survive those altitudes. Starting fresh would have taken years we didn't have, and resources that no longer existed. Major Taruhiko Kobayashi's famous 244th Sentai scored over 100 victories against American aircraft, but barely touched the B-29s. As he later put it, my squadron included some of Japan's finest pilots, men with years of experience fighting over China and the Pacific. Against the B-29, none of that mattered. They flew in a world we couldn't reach. Skill became irrelevant when your airplane simply couldn't get to the enemy. We watched our homeland burn, full of determination but powerless to defend it. Lieutenant Thomas Cartwright, a B-29 navigator, described the same encounter from the opposite perspective. Working in a pressurized cabin meant no masks, no frozen fingers. We could spread our maps, use every instrument precisely, talk freely over the intercom. Meanwhile, Japanese navigators fought fogged goggles, frozen controls, and oxygen deprivation. Our technology made every part of the job easier, not just flying higher, but fighting smarter. Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto, an anti-aircraft commander, explained how useless ground fire had become. Our biggest guns could, in theory, reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at that height was a fantasy. The dispersion was enormous. We fired thousands of rounds to bring down a single bomber. We were draining ammunition stores for no result. The B-29s were untouchable, shielded by altitude more effectively than armor. Maintenance reports tell the same story. Engines demanded complete overhauls after just a few full-power climbs. Superchargers failed constantly, and replacement parts were non-existent. Oxygen systems leaked, carbon dioxide scrubbers ran short, and worn-out fighters were grounded faster than they could be replaced. It wasn't enemy fire that reduced Japan's interceptor numbers, it was mechanical exhaustion. From his B-29 tail turret, Sergeant Robert Goldsborough remembered watching the enemy struggle upward. I had the best view of them back there. You'd see little specks growing slowly larger, crawling up toward us. Some would fire from miles out, their tracers arced up and fell away. Others would zoom, climb, hang there for a second like they might actually reach us, then drop out of the sky. I almost never had to fire. They just couldn't get close enough. It wasn't arrogance, it was simple physics. That mismatch went beyond altitude. It was baked into every part of the war in the air. The B-29 carried radar, long-range radios, advanced navigation equipment, and heated flight suits. Even its guns were aimed with analog computers. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, suffered constant radio failures and used outdated optical sights. The industrial divide was absolute. While the U.S. built nearly 4,000 B-29s with mass production precision, Japan could barely produce a few hundred fighters, many assembled by hand in scattered workshops after bombing raids destroyed factories. Attempts to copy captured American or German technology failed because Japan simply didn't have the alloys, synthetic rubbers, or machining accuracy required. Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Kawamoto, who led special attack units over Nagoya, summed it up grimly. We tried everything: night attacks, dawn interceptions, even coordinated suicide rammings. Nothing worked for long. Every time we adapted, they changed tactics. When we trained for night fighting, they returned to high-altitude daylight raids. They always stayed one step ahead. They had every advantage. All we had was determination. The truth was that the B-29 wasn't just another bomber. It was a weapon system, engineered from the start for the Pacific War. Boeing's designers gave it the range to strike Japan from bases thousands of miles away, the altitude to evade interception, and the firepower to defend itself without escorts. Every inch of its design embodied the belief that technology could win wars, and it did. After the war, nearly every major advancement in aviation traced its roots back to the B-29. Pressurization became standard in commercial airliners. Turbo supercharging led directly to jet engine efficiency at high altitude. Remote-controlled gun turrets evolved into the early concepts of modern fly-by-wire systems. The lessons learned over Japan built the foundation of the modern aerospace industry.
Captain Kazuo Unoda, who commanded a Ki-84 squadron during Japan's final days, described the psychological toll. Our most advanced fighter meant nothing. Below 25,000 feet we could fight. Above that we were ghosts. Pilots came home silent, not from fear but from shame. We hadn't even fired our guns. The knowledge that we were beaten by machines, not men, broke our spirit more than any defeat in battle. For the Americans, the B-29 campaign vindicated the entire concept of strategic bombing. Altitude sanctuary allowed systematic destruction of Japan's industrial and military infrastructure without catastrophic losses. The atomic missions were only possible because no interceptor could reach them. General Henry Hap Arnold called it proof that technology could replace mass. We showed that victory could come not from numbers but from innovation, he said. The B-29 proved that altitude, engineering, and precision could end wars. And, in the end, Japan's leaders saw it too. The inability to defend against those silver bombers made clear that the nation's defeat wasn't just military, it was technological. Factories lay in ruins, and the sky itself belonged to the enemy. That realization shaped Emperor Hirohito's fateful decision to accept unconditional surrender. Resistance had become meaningless when destruction could fall from heights no Japanese aircraft could ever reach. The B-29 had rewritten the rules of war, proving once and for all that in the age of industry, courage alone could not hold back progress. Continued resistance had become nothing more than sacrifice without purpose. Chief Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, a veteran B-29 engineer, maintained the Superfortress systems throughout the Pacific campaign. The pressurization gear was complicated, he said, but if you kept it tuned, it never failed. The turbo superchargers were temperamental, but they gave us full power even where Japanese engines could barely breathe. Every system, every bolt and circuit was the result of years of engineering and industrial capability that Japan simply didn't have. We didn't just win through bravery, we won through design and production. On the other side, Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, who flew the Ki-61 in repeated and futile interception attempts, remembered the human cost. Each mission pushed us to the edge. Breathing was agony even with oxygen. The cold bit into our hands until they went numb. Our eyes stung from the dry, thin air, and then we'd watch those silver bombers glide above us, untouchable as fire consumed our cities. It broke something inside us. We felt we had failed our ancestors, our emperor, our people, not because we lacked courage, but because our machines weren't good enough. The scale of America's industrial power dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. The B-29 program alone cost more than Japan's entire wartime aviation budget. U.S. factories achieved levels of precision and standardization that ensured every Superfortress performed exactly as designed. Japan, relying on smaller workshops and inconsistent materials, simply couldn't compete. That industrial asymmetry magnified the technological gap until it became unbridgeable. General Curtis LeMay's tactical innovations only deepened that advantage. His decision to shift from high-altitude precision raids to low-altitude night firebombing turned the B-29 into an unstoppable weapon. Radar-guided bombing, incendiary payloads, and massed formations devastated Japan's cities regardless of altitude or weather. Each adaptation by the Japanese was met by a new American innovation, faster than they could respond. Flexibility, backed by technology, became the ultimate weapon. The B-29 campaign transformed the world's understanding of air power. It proved that machines and manufacturing could achieve effects once thought possible only through vast armies. Industrial capacity itself had become a form of strategy, factories as decisive as front lines. Those lessons carried directly into the Cold War. The principles learned over Tokyo, long-range bombing, high-altitude flight, technological dominance, and psychological deterrence became the blueprint for the age of nuclear strategy. The B-29's legacy lived on in the B-47 Stratojet, the B-52 Superfortress, and every strategic bomber that followed. In the end, despite the courage, skill, and sacrifice of Japan's finest pilots, the result was inevitable. Technology had rendered bravery obsolete. The altitude sanctuary created by pressurization and turbo supercharging gave the Americans a shield the Japanese could never penetrate. Coupled with unmatched industrial might, that advantage was absolute. The skies over Japan proved a truth that would define modern warfare, that wars are won as much in factories and laboratories as on the battlefield. The B-29's dominance wasn't just a triumph of aviation, it was the moment humanity crossed the threshold into a new era of warfare, where innovation, not valor, would decide the fate of nations.